He smiled. Not the nervous smile of a scared kid, but the cold, calculated grin of someone who believed he'd just beaten the system. 12 years old, sitting in a courtroom, accused of a murder so brutal it left even veteran detectives speechless. While most kids his age were arguing about video games and homework, David Harvey was orchestrating something far darker, something that would tear through the heart of Miami and force an entire city to ask a terrifying question. Can someone be born evil? Because when that verdict finally came down, and the judge uttered the words, "life in prison," that same smile didn't fade. It grew. What drove a child to commit a crime that defied all reason? What twisted path led from innocent playgrounds to a murder so methodical it felt almost practiced? This is the story of the youngest killer to ever shake Miami, a story that forces us to look directly into the eyes of pure evil and see a child staring back. If stories like this make you question just how far the human mind can go, hit that like button. It really helps more people find documentaries like this. Don't forget to subscribe for more deep dives into the darkest corners of true crime. And hey, share this one, because some stories are too haunting to stay hidden. He smiled. That single expression, small, almost casual, froze the entire courtroom. Not because it was out of place, but because it was so perfectly wrong. A 12-year-old boy, barely tall enough for his feet to touch the floor beneath the defendant's table, sitting there as if this were all a strange school play. The judge read his sentence in the same tone he used for men twice, even 3 times the boy's age. Life in prison. There were gasps from the gallery, muffled sobs from the victim's family, and still, the boy smiled. It wasn't the nervous grin of a scared child. It was smug, deliberate, calculated. The kind of smile that says, "I told you I'd win." That moment became the snapshot that would haunt Miami for years to come. A photograph burned into the public consciousness, replayed endlessly on news broadcasts, dissected in living rooms and classrooms alike. Because people couldn't understand how a child, someone who should have been worrying about spelling tests and soccer practice, could sit there, listening to his own life being erased by law, and smile. What kind of 12-year-old does that? What kind of human being can? Reporters who covered that day still talk about the silence that followed the verdict. Not the quiet of relief or grief, but the thick, suffocating silence of disbelief. Detectives who had spent months unraveling the horror behind David Harvey's crime stood by the courtroom doors, their expressions hardened into something close to resignation. They'd seen death before. They'd seen monsters. But this was different. Evil wasn't supposed to come packaged in sneakers and a school uniform. Evil wasn't supposed to have braces or ask for a juice box during interrogation. The judge himself, Arthur Hughes, a man known for composure, had to pause before delivering the sentence. He looked at the boy in front of him, saw that faint, defiant curl at the corner of his lips, and hesitated, as if the entire system had suddenly realized it was confronting something it had no protocol for. You could almost hear the question hanging unspoken in the air. What do we do with a monster who still needs a booster seat to reach the microphone? Outside the courthouse, Miami was buzzing. Camera crews, protesters, and curious onlookers crowding the steps. Some demanded leniency, arguing that no child should be sentenced to life behind bars. Others shouted for justice, convinced that anyone capable of such cruelty forfeited the right to mercy. The city had become divided, torn between empathy and outrage, hope and horror. For many, it wasn't just about David Harvey. It was about the uncomfortable idea that darkness this profound could exist so young, right under everyone's noses. Psychologists filled talk shows debating whether David was a product of neglect, environment, or something more primal. Was he made or born this way? Parents began locking their doors tighter, teachers looked at their classrooms differently, and kids started whispering his name like he was a ghost story. The boy killer, they called him. The newspapers loved that headline. But behind the sensationalism was something more unsettling, the dawning realization that David Harvey didn't look like a monster because that's exactly what made him one. He blended in. He was every parent's worst nightmare, the danger you never saw coming. Inside the courtroom, after the gavel fell, David leaned back in his chair. His face remained still, except for that faint smile tugging at his mouth. The judge's words seemed to bounce right off him. When bailiffs moved to escort him out, he didn't cry, didn't plead, didn't even blink. He turned his head once, just once, to glance at Christopher Davis's parents sitting a few rows behind the prosecution's table. Maria Davis was trembling, her face buried in her husband's hands. Robert stared straight ahead, jaw locked, eyes red but dry. And that's when David's smile widened. A look that wasn't born of fear or confusion, but satisfaction. To him, it wasn't an ending. It was a victory. That smirk, caught on every camera lens, told the world everything it needed to know. David Harvey didn't see himself as a child being punished. He saw himself as a legend being born. And in that haunting moment, beneath the sterile hum of courtroom lights and the echo of a father's broken heart, Miami realized it wasn't just witnessing a crime. It was witnessing the making of something darker. The birth of a child who wanted to be remembered not for what he lost, but for what he took. On the surface, the Harvey home was indistinguishable from any other house in the manicured neighborhoods of northern Miami. The lawn was neatly trimmed, the driveway spotless, and a basketball hoop stood slightly crooked beside a two-car garage that smelled faintly of motor oil and summer afternoons. Neighbors described it as quiet, normal, boring in the best way. David Harvey, at 12 years old, blended perfectly into that picture of middle-class tranquility. He rode his bike in the cul-de-sac after school, waved at passing cars, and sometimes helped old Mrs. Sanderson carry groceries from her trunk. His mother, Denise, was a dental hygienist with a smile that could light up a room. His father, Richard, worked long hours as an accountant, quiet, distant, the kind of man who measured success by stability. They were, in every sense, the ideal suburban family. And yet, behind those white curtains and picture frames filled with forced smiles, something was beginning to rot. There was no screaming, no violence, no storm that gave away the coming darkness. Just a quiet emptiness, a silence too polished, too perfect. In hindsight, everyone said they'd never noticed anything strange about David. But that's the thing about evil in its earliest form. It doesn't announce itself. It whispers. It hides in the ordinary. It learns to smile back. David's childhood room looked typical enough. Posters of superheroes, shelves lined with action figures, a neat bed his mother bragged about to co-workers. But inside, the desk drawers were spiral notebooks packed with tidy handwriting, dark fantasies disguised as stories. He called them scenarios. In them, strangers were kidnapped, tied up, silenced, and studied. He diagrammed them with the precision of a future engineer, but what he built on paper wasn't machines. It was control. At an age when most children were still afraid of the dark, David was teaching himself how to live in it. By the time he entered middle school, the cracks in that perfect suburban portrait had begun to widen, though only a few people glimpsed them. He had friends, if you could call them that. Boys he played video games with, kids from down the street who thought he was a little weird but smart. He'd smile, laugh in all the right places, but something in his tone always seemed slightly off, like he was imitating emotion rather than feeling it. Teachers wrote notes home, praising his manners and curiosity. His mother pinned them on the fridge, proud proof that her son was special. At night she'd pass his room and hear the soft click of a computer mouse, assuming he was doing homework. In reality, David was reading crime scene reports, downloading autopsy photos he'd found on obscure corners of the internet. He memorized terminology the way other kids memorized sports stats. Ligature, strangulation, post-mortem lividity, words he rolled around in his head like secret treasures. He wasn't horrified. He was fascinated. When he saw a dead bird on the sidewalk, he didn't step around it. He crouched to watch the ants claiming it, whispering observations under his breath. It was his private classroom. He began experimenting, first with insects, then with frogs, stray lizards, later the neighborhood pets that went missing one by one. The local vet blamed coyotes. Mrs. Sanderson cried over her cat for weeks. David watched her with polite sympathy, hands folded, eyes bright with something that looked an awful lot like pride. His sister, Emily, saw it. She told their parents again that her brother scared her, that she woke up some nights to find him standing in her doorway just watching. Denise scolded her for telling stories. Richard didn't even look up from his laptop. In that house, silence had become their language, and denial its punctuation mark. Outside those walls, life went on exactly as planned. Birthday parties, PTA meetings, church on Sundays, a flawless performance that convinced everyone, including themselves, that nothing was wrong. Yet inside David's head, a darker rhythm had taken over. He started timing things. How long it took a hamster to stop moving, how quickly the light faded from its eyes. He kept notes in tidy columns, as though gathering data for a science fair. When a guidance counselor once asked him to write about his dream job, he wrote 3 words, to be remembered. The counselor smiled, thinking it was poetic. But to David, memory wasn't about legacy, it was about domination. He wanted to leave a mark that couldn't be erased. Around this time, he discovered the online forums where true crime enthusiasts swapped theories and sometimes glorified killers as misunderstood geniuses. He didn't just lurk, he participated. He crafted elaborate posts, analyzing famous murders, slipping easily into the language of the predator. To him, those killers weren't cautionary tales. They were mentors. He started to mimic their methods in miniature, testing boundaries, pushing further each time. When a classmate's hamster disappeared from the classroom cage, he watched her cry and felt something electric spark inside him. A rush that had nothing to do with empathy and everything to do with power. It was the first time he realized that suffering was a form of currency, and he liked spending it. Still, he kept the mask intact. He laughed at jokes, aced his tests, and charmed adults who saw only potential. What they didn't see was the notebook hidden behind his dresser, a growing catalog of cruelty disguised as innocence. By the spring before the murder, that double life had become seamless. He had perfected the art of being invisible, of moving through his world as a polite shadow. His parents' marriage was unraveling quietly, each retreating into separate corners of the house. Denise told herself her son's detachment was just adolescence. Richard told himself he was too busy to notice. Emily had stopped complaining altogether. The more she spoke, the less she was heard, so she learned to stay out of his way. But David noticed her silence and fed on it. He'd whisper threats only she could hear, little sentences meant to keep her afraid. Not because he wanted to hurt her, but because he loved knowing he could. Control was becoming his favorite language. In school, he joined the photography club, claiming he wanted to learn how to capture emotion. The irony was cruel. Every photo he took drained the life from its subject, turning smiles into something hollow. One picture in particular, a candid shot of his teacher's face mid-laugh, hung on the hallway bulletin board for weeks. Most people thought it was charming. A few felt unsettled without knowing why. That was David's specialty. He could make unease feel like admiration. On weekends, he volunteered at an animal shelter, not out of kindness, but access. The staff thought he was a quiet, helpful boy. No one noticed the missing files, the late-night visits, the kittens that simply ran off. By summer, the secret box under his bed had grown heavy. Inside were the relics of his rehearsals: collars, feathers, trinkets, each tagged with dates and notes. It wasn't enough anymore. The thrill faded faster each time, leaving only the craving for something bigger, more human. And in the quiet suburb where nothing ever really happened, David Harvey began to imagine what it would feel like to make something happen, something unforgettable. Christopher Davis was the kind of man people described as genuinely good, and they meant it. He wasn't extraordinary in the way that demands attention. He was extraordinary in the quiet, consistent way that builds trust. 24 years old, tall but slightly shy in posture, with the kind of smile that seemed to put the world at ease. He had grown up in the same Miami neighborhoods where palm trees arched over cracked sidewalks and laughter from open windows mingled with the distant thrum of traffic. His life was small, perhaps, but solid. Christopher had recently graduated from Florida International University with a degree in education, hoping to teach one day. But dreams didn't pay medical bills, so he worked 2 jobs: mornings at a local cafe, nights at a small hardware store where he'd been since high school. Every dollar went toward caring for his mother, Maria, whose health had been fragile since his father's passing. He never complained. He didn't know how. His friends would tease him for being too kind, too forgiving, the type of person who'd give away his umbrella and walk home soaked himself. "Chris, you're going to get eaten alive one day," his co-worker once joked. He'd just laughed. "Maybe," he said, "but I'd rather be the meal than the monster." No one knew how hauntingly true those words would become. His days were predictable, structured like clockwork. He'd wake before sunrise, make his mother breakfast, and hum softly while the coffee brewed. Always the same tune, something she'd played when he was a boy. After work, he'd stop by the park near their apartment, watching kids play basketball while he graded practice teaching plans or sketched ideas for classroom activities. He had that patient energy that made children instinctively trust him, the kind that radiated safety. Maybe that's what made him stand out to David Harvey. It wasn't what Christopher did that made him a target. It was who he was. In a city that often felt restless, predatory, and fast, Christopher embodied the rarest thing of all: goodness without agenda. He believed in people, believed in the idea that kindness could still make a difference. That belief would draw him straight into the orbit of someone who saw compassion not as virtue, but as weakness to exploit. And yet, for all the darkness that would come to surround his name, Christopher's story deserves more than tragedy. Before he became a headline, he was a son, a friend, a dreamer, a man trying to build a quiet life in a loud world. The first time David Harvey saw Christopher, it was almost by accident. The boy had been riding his bike home from school, cutting through the row of shops that lined Coral Way. He noticed the hardware store, a small, family-run place with faded signage and an open light that flickered like an old heartbeat. Inside, Christopher was helping an older customer find the right screws for a loose window hinge. David watched from outside, unnoticed, his bike balanced between his knees. There was something about Christopher's tone, soft, patient, completely devoid of irritation, that caught his attention. People rarely spoke like that to strangers. David lingered, pretending to tie his shoe, listening through the glass. He watched how easily Christopher moved, how he smiled at every question, how he thanked the customer as though it were an honor to help. It wasn't admiration that David felt. It was curiosity, the same kind of curiosity that made him study the mechanics of insects. He couldn't understand why someone would give so freely, why kindness didn't make them feel weak. He found it fascinating. Over the next few weeks, David began to watch more often, sometimes from across the street, sometimes from his bike parked near the corner. He memorized Christopher's routine the way some kids memorized cheat codes for video games: his shifts, his brakes, even the bus he took when it rained. To David, it wasn't stalking. It was observation, preparation. Christopher Davis was about to become his first real experiment. The universe has a cruel way of setting up its tragedies so they feel inevitable in hindsight. Christopher never noticed the boy. Why would he? In Miami, kids darted through every corner of the city, running errands, skating on sidewalks, laughing too loud. A 12-year-old watching from a bench meant nothing. Christopher's kindness was his compass. It guided everything he did. When someone asked for help, he answered. When someone seemed lost, he offered directions. When someone looked like they were in trouble, he stopped. That's what he did on the night he disappeared. The details, pieced together later by investigators, were painfully mundane. Christopher had just finished his closing shift, waved goodbye to his coworker, and stepped out into the humid Miami air. His bus stop was 3 blocks away, lit only by the dim yellow glow of a flickering street lamp. He never made it there. A witness would later recall seeing a small figure, a boy, standing near the alley, crying. "He looked so scared," the witness said. "He was saying something like, 'Please, my friend's hurt.'" Christopher, being Christopher, didn't hesitate. He followed. And that was the last time anyone saw him alive. For days, his mother called his phone every hour, her voice breaking into smaller and smaller pieces with each unanswered ring. His friends posted flyers, taped them to bus stops, to street lights, to cafe doors. The city moved in slow motion. Every missing poster carried the same photo, Christopher smiling beside his mother, arm draped protectively around her shoulder. Reporters described him as kind, promising, the sort of man who restored your faith in people. The irony was unbearable. The same heart that made him loved by everyone was the one that led him straight to the monster waiting in the dark. The crime scene, when police found it 3 days later, told the rest of the story in silence. It was clinical, controlled, stripped of chaos. That's what chilled detectives most. There was no rage in what had been done, no frenzy, no confusion. It was methodical, rehearsed, and at its center lay the body of a man who had once believed the world was good. Christopher Davis's life had ended not with a scream, but with a question. Why? In the weeks that followed, Miami transformed from a city of sunlight into a city of shadows. People locked their doors earlier. Strangers stopped making eye contact. News anchors repeated his name like a prayer and a warning all at once. "Who could do this?" they asked, their voices heavy with disbelief. And when the answer finally came, when detectives realized that the fingerprint lifted from a soda bottle belonged to a 12-year-old boy, the disbelief turned to horror. The world tried to make sense of it, but how do you explain the senseless? How do you comprehend a child who kills a man for curiosity? Even as investigators pieced together the timeline, as psychologists dissected motive, as the public tried to decide whether David Harvey was born broken or made that way, one truth remained unbearable. Christopher Davis died because he cared, because he believed, even in a world that gave him little reason to, that goodness mattered. That's what evil takes first. Not your life, but your faith in the light. Christopher's legacy, though stained by tragedy, endured in the people who knew him. His mother kept his graduation photo on the mantle, the glass cracked but never replaced. His friends planted a tree in his name in the park where he used to sit and watch the kids play. And sometimes, when the sun hit it just right, you could almost believe that his light, brief but brilliant, still lingered in the leaves. Evil doesn't erupt overnight. It matures quietly, feeding off silence, growing bolder in the shadows. For David Harvey, the line between curiosity and cruelty had vanished long before the world ever heard his name. After Christopher Davis's disappearance, the city's grief was palpable, but David, 12 years old, freckle-faced, polite, seemed unfazed. He went to school as if nothing had happened. He laughed at jokes, raised his hand in class, even asked the teacher if she'd heard about that poor man on the news. No one suspected that the boy asking was the same one who had watched life drain from Christopher's eyes only days earlier. To his classmates, David was just David. Quiet, maybe a little odd, but harmless. To his parents, he was a good kid who needed space. To the detectives, he didn't exist yet, but to himself he was something else entirely. He was evolving. Every killer has a first moment of power, the instant they realize they can decide whether someone lives or dies. For David, that power became a drug. It filled the emptiness he'd felt for years, replacing confusion with control, fear with fascination. The night after the murder, he didn't cry or panic. He slept soundly, and when he woke the next morning, he felt alive in a way he never had before. He'd done it, crossed the threshold between imagination and action, and the world hadn't changed. The sun still rose. His mother still called him for breakfast. The universe hadn't punished him. If anything, it seemed to reward him with a dangerous new belief that he was untouchable. In the weeks that followed, David's behavior didn't unravel. It sharpened. That's what unnerved the psychologists who later studied him. He didn't spiral into guilt or fear. Instead, he became more focused, more deliberate, as though the act of killing had refined him. He began cataloging his memories of the murder with clinical precision, rewriting them in his notebook like a scientist documenting an experiment. He rated his own performance, noting what worked and what didn't, how long it took, how his victim reacted, what sounds were made. Each detail fascinated him. He wasn't reliving horror. He was analyzing technique. And all the while, he played the role of the perfect son. Denise noticed how often he smiled now, how his eyes seemed brighter, how he volunteered to do the dishes. She mistook it for maturity. "He's finally growing up," she told her sister one evening, pride softening her exhaustion. But the truth was darker. David wasn't growing up. He was perfecting his disguise. His father, Richard, still distracted by long hours at the office, didn't see the subtle changes. The way David's handwriting had grown neater, his posture straighter, his gaze colder. There were no outbursts, no warning signs that fit neatly into the psychology textbooks. Evil, in its truest form, doesn't always announce itself with rage. Sometimes it comes in the shape of composure. Meanwhile, the Miami-Dade Police Department was drowning in dead ends. Christopher's murder had stunned even veteran detectives. There were no obvious enemies, no history of violence, no motive. His wallet was untouched, his watch still on his wrist. The brutality of the crime suggested rage, but the precision hinted at something else, something methodical. This wasn't a crime of passion, Detective Mark Johnson muttered during one of their late-night reviews. This was practice. He didn't know how right he was. The city wanted answers, the media wanted a monster, and the police wanted anything that made sense. But David had left almost nothing behind. Almost. That single soda bottle, half buried in grass near the abduction site, looked like trash until a forensics tech bagged it out of habit. It would take weeks before the lab processed it, and even longer before anyone imagined running it through the juvenile database. While the investigation stumbled forward, David was already moving on. He watched the news obsessively, savoring every mention of the unknown killer. When he saw the candlelight vigils, the tearful interviews with Christopher's friends, the city's collective mourning, he didn't feel remorse. He felt pride. The entire world was reacting to something he had created. To him, it was proof of greatness. In his twisted logic, Christopher's death was art, and Miami was his audience. As time passed, David began planning again, though this time it wasn't about killing. It was about control. He wanted to test how far his invisibility could stretch. He started inserting himself into the periphery of the investigation. When his school held a safety assembly after the murder, he volunteered to read the victims' names aloud. No one questioned it. His calm, steady voice earned polite applause. The counselor even thanked him for being so brave. That night, he wrote in his notebook, "They cheer the wolf when he wears a lamb's smile." It wasn't a confession. It was a revelation. Every adult who praised him only deepened his belief that he was smarter than all of them. His cruelty grew quieter, more deliberate. The neighborhood pet stopped disappearing because he'd grown bored. He wanted a different kind of thrill now, the power to deceive. He'd sit at dinner, listening to his parents argue softly about bills or chores, and think about how little they saw. The woman who tucked him in every night didn't realize she was living with a predator. Sometimes when she kissed his forehead, he'd suppress the urge to laugh. "Good night, sweet boy," she'd whisper, and he'd whisper back, "Good night, Mom," knowing that if she ever saw who he truly was, she'd never sleep again. The only person who still sensed something wrong was Emily. She didn't speak to him anymore, barely looked at him, but when she did, her eyes were always wide, terrified. He liked that. Fear, he realized, was a kind of worship. Summer turned to fall, and the investigation finally caught up. The fingerprint matched. The officers who arrived at the Harvey residence didn't believe the results at first. It had to be a mistake. But procedure was procedure. When they knocked on the door, David answered, calm and polite, controller in hand, the faint hum of a video game behind him. Denise appeared seconds later, confused, wiping her hands on a dish towel. Within minutes, the house that had always been so pristine was flooded with police. Richard arrived from work to find his son being led away in handcuffs, expressionless, barefoot. "This is insane!" Denise shouted, demanding explanations, threatening lawsuits. David didn't resist. He looked around the room, the family photos, the ticking clock, his sister peeking from the hallway, and smiled. That same small, knowing smile that had first chilled Detective Johnson to the bone. In the car, he didn't ask where they were going. He already knew. He had imagined this moment countless times, rehearsed every expression, every breath. This wasn't fear. This was performance. The interrogation room was cold, but David seemed at home there. He sat with his hands folded, posture perfect, eyes bright. When Johnson entered, he greeted him with a politeness that felt rehearsed. "Am I under arrest, sir?" he asked, his tone almost cheerful. The detective's stomach turned. He'd interrogated killers, rapists, gang leaders, but never a boy who looked like he'd just come from math class. The conversation started with routine questions and ended in a confession that would echo through every corner of Miami. David described the crime not with emotion, but with elegance, step by step, like a magician revealing his trick. He corrected Johnson on minor details, smiled when the detective flinched, and when asked why, tilted his head and said, "I wanted to know what it felt like, to matter." The psychologists who later studied his taped confession called it a masterclass in controlled narcissism. He didn't fidget, didn't hesitate. His voice never cracked. There was no remorse, no fear, only fascination. He relished the chance to narrate his own myth. Each word he spoke seemed chosen for effect, every pause deliberate. When one of the investigators leaned forward and whispered, "Do you understand what you've done?" David smiled softly. "Of course," he said. "I've done something no one else my age ever has." For him, it wasn't guilt that defined the aftermath. It was ownership. He saw himself not as a criminal, but as a pioneer. That night, when detectives escorted him from the precinct to juvenile holding, he didn't cry. He looked up at the moon through the patrol car window and whispered something that made the officer beside him uneasy. "It's perfect tonight." The officer asked what he meant. David didn't answer. Maybe he was admiring the symmetry, the same moon that had watched over the crime now shining over his arrest. Or maybe he was simply thinking about what came next. Because for David Harvey, Even captivity was just another experiment, another chance to test how far he could bend a world that never saw him coming. Miami has seen darkness before. It's a city that lives in duality, golden beaches by day, neon shadows by night. But what happened in the summer of 2013 cut deeper than any drug war or gang shooting. It wasn't a headline about corruption or organized crime. It was something infinitely smaller, quieter, and somehow more terrifying. A crime that began with a child's lie and ended with the kind of horror no one could explain. The story of Christopher Davis's murder didn't just shock the city, it wounded it. Detectives who'd handled dozens of homicides admitted they'd never seen anything like it. The violence itself was unspeakable, but it wasn't the brutality that stayed with them. It was the intent, the absence of rage, the precision, the quiet. When the first responding officers arrived at that small apartment complex, the night was thick with humidity and confusion. A neighbor had reported a foul smell seeping through the vents. They thought they'd find a body, maybe an overdose. What they found instead was a scene that felt staged, too controlled, too deliberate. Christopher's body lay in the center of the room, positioned with an almost ritualistic order. His hands were folded across his chest. His eyes had been closed. There was no chaos, no overturned furniture, no frantic struggle, just a horrifying calm. One officer later said it felt like walking into a room where evil had politely tidied up after itself. The apartment itself was sparse. No forced entry, nothing stolen, no signs of desperation. The only clue was the faint smell of soda and the half-empty bottle lying near the doorway. The medical examiner's report would later describe the crime as methodically inflicted trauma consistent with prolonged restraint. But for the detectives standing in that room, the details blurred together into something almost surreal. The air conditioning hummed softly. A television flickered with static in the corner. A glass of water sat untouched on the counter. It was as if Christopher had been interrupted mid-life, his humanity suddenly erased by something mechanical, something cold. Detective Mark Johnson, the lead investigator, stood by the window, staring at the faint reflection of flashing red and blue lights outside. "This wasn't a robbery," he murmured. "This was control." That word, control, would echo through the entire case. Whoever had done this hadn't just wanted to kill, they'd wanted to own the moment, to orchestrate it. When the forensic team began combing through the apartment, they found almost nothing to work with. No fingerprints, no DNA, no fibers, nothing, except that soda bottle. It was out of place, too deliberate to ignore. The label was worn from the humidity, but the surface held a single clear print, small, almost delicate. At first it didn't make sense. How could hands that small commit a crime this sophisticated? The bottle was bagged, cataloged, and sent to the lab, filed under unlikely lead. No one could have guessed that it was the key to everything. As the investigation deepened, the city began to unravel. Miami is no stranger to fear, but this was different. This wasn't the fear of random violence. It was the fear of the unknown, a predator without a pattern, a killer who didn't fit the mold. Every news station ran the same story: murder without motive. Reporters stood outside the Davis family apartment complex, their voices hushed, their expressions grave. Candlelight vigils filled the streets. Strangers cried for a man they'd never met. And in the midst of all that mourning, in a quiet suburban living room miles away, David Harvey sat cross-legged on the carpet, watching himself on the news. He studied the coverage like an artist critiquing his own work. He'd pause the screen when they showed Christopher's photo, tilt his head, and smile. To him, the reporters were narrating his masterpiece. His parents, oblivious, assumed the footage scared him. "It's awful," Denise whispered one night, turning away from the TV. "That poor boy." David didn't respond. He just stared, his reflection ghosted across the screen. The next morning, he went to school, answered questions about the murder with wide-eyed innocence, and watched his classmates shiver. It wasn't just that he had killed, it was that he'd learned how invisible he truly was. The monster had found his mask, and the world had given him applause for wearing it well. Meanwhile, Detective Johnson was losing sleep. He couldn't shake the image of Christopher's body, the quiet order of it all. It didn't fit any pattern he knew. The crime didn't scream chaos. It whispered intelligence. Whoever did this wasn't just capable, they were comfortable. "We're not looking for a lunatic," he told his partner. "We're looking for a student." The discovery of the fingerprint changed everything. When the call came in from the lab, no one believed it. The match had come from a juvenile database, an automatic system that also logged school field trip permission slips and community center volunteer forms. It shouldn't have been relevant, but there it was. David Harvey, age 12. A routine cross-check had flagged the print from a middle school science fair entry, David's project, ironically titled The Science of Decomposition. At first, the detectives laughed it off, a glitch, a coincidence. But the more they verified, the more impossible it became to deny. The print was perfect, undeniable. It matched the bottle down to the ridge. Johnson reread the report twice before saying a word. "Run it again," he ordered, voice tight. They did. Same result. The room fell silent. "Jesus," someone whispered. "He's a kid." Johnson didn't answer. He was already picturing that crime scene again, the precision, the calm, the control, and feeling a chill run through him. The evidence had always suggested intelligence, patience, planning. None of that belonged to a 12-year-old, and yet the proof was staring him in the face. When they arrived at the Harvey home, he half expected the door to open on a teenager with a crew cut and a secret life. Instead, a small, polite boy in a t-shirt opened it, controller in hand, blinking curiously. "Can I help you?" he asked. That moment, Johnson would later admit, broke something inside him. It was one thing to hunt monsters. It was another to realize they might look like this. David's arrest spread through Miami like wildfire. The story of the 12-year-old killer dominated headlines, turning local outrage into national fascination. Psychologists, pundits, and pastors all weighed in, trying to make sense of the senseless. How could a child commit such a crime? What does it mean for innocence if a 12-year-old can show none? But behind the noise, the truth was quieter and infinitely more disturbing. In interrogation, David spoke with the calm of a professor giving a lecture. He corrected detectives on terminology, explained his reasoning with chilling detachment. He described the murder not as an act of violence, but as an experiment in control. To him, Christopher wasn't a man. He was a variable, a chance to see what it felt like to decide. When asked if he regretted it, he paused for a long moment, then said softly, "No, I learned a lot." Johnson, hardened by years of homicide work, pushed his chair back, fighting nausea. He realized what he was looking at wasn't madness, it was emptiness. A void shaped like a boy. The interrogation tape would later become mandatory viewing at several FBI behavioral seminars. Not because of what David said, but because of how he said it, with poise, intelligence, and not a shred of fear. By the time the press conference was held, the city had already made up its mind. This wasn't a child. This was evil wearing the skin of one. And as the courthouse filled with cameras, as the Davis family sat weeping in the front row, David Harvey walked in wearing a small, almost curious smile. The city of Miami, drenched in sunlight and denial, finally saw the darkness that had been growing in its heart all along. Sometimes it only takes one mistake to make the truth impossible to ignore. For weeks, the Miami-Dade Police Department had been buried under dead ends, red herrings, and pressure from every direction. The public wanted a face to hate, the department wanted answers, and Detective Mark Johnson just wanted sleep. But in the sterile hum of the forensics lab, truth was waiting, pressed into the condensation of a single soda bottle. When the technician held it under ultraviolet light, the pattern glowed faintly. Ridges, swirls, loops. At first glance, it meant nothing. They'd collected hundreds of prints. Neighbors, co-workers, passers-by. But when the digital scan came back with a hit from a juvenile record, the room went silent. The print wasn't from a criminal file. It came from a school database. "This has to be wrong," the technician muttered. "It's a kid." Yet the system didn't lie. The fingerprint on that bottle matched perfectly to one taken during a middle school science fair. The name attached to it was David Harvey, 12 years old, no prior incidents, straight-A student, scout member. The discovery didn't just shock investigators, it defied belief. How could a child's hand leave its mark on a crime scene that looked like it had been orchestrated by a meticulous adult? Johnson stared at the report for a long time before speaking. "Run it again," he said, his voice low. They did. The result didn't change. The fingerprint spoke clearly, and it was saying something no one wanted to hear. The moment the match was confirmed, everything changed. The case that had seemed unsolvable suddenly had a name, and that name spread through the department like wildfire. Officers gathered in small, stunned clusters, whispering disbelief. 12? Someone muttered. "That's not possible." But the evidence was irrefutable. Within hours, a task force was mobilized, not to hunt an armed fugitive, but to prepare the delicate operation of arresting a child. No one wanted to be the one to put cuffs on a boy who still carried a school ID. Yet protocol was protocol. Johnson, exhausted and hollow-eyed, made the call himself. "We treat it like any other suspect," he told his team, though his voice betrayed uncertainty. "By the book." They arrived at the Harvey residence in the late afternoon. The street was quiet, lined with manicured lawns and the scent of freshly watered grass. The image of innocence. When David opened the door, he looked almost angelic, barefoot, controller in hand, a smear of peanut butter on his sleeve. Denise Harvey appeared behind him, smiling politely until she saw the badges. The confusion on her face curdled into disbelief, then horror. "My son?" she whispered. "You think my son did what?" Johnson barely had the words. As officers read the Miranda rights, David stood still, blinking, expressionless. The cuffs clicked into place with a soft finality that echoed louder than any siren. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. The door closed behind them, and Miami would never be the same. Within hours, the story detonated. 12-year-old boy arrested for murder flashed across every major news network, spreading from Miami to every corner of the country. The fingerprint had done more than solve a case. It had exposed a fracture in the collective understanding of what evil looked like. The press swarmed the Harvey neighborhood, cameras flashing against the windows of the house that had once been just another dot on a map. Neighbors who had once waved politely now spoke in hushed disbelief. "He was always so polite," one woman told reporters. "You'd never think—" The interviews blurred together, shock, denial, outrage. Every photo of David became a contradiction, the cherubic smile, the wide eyes, the innocence that no longer fit. Talk shows dissected the case from every angle. Psychologists argued over whether a child could truly comprehend murder. Politicians called for reforms in juvenile law. And through it all, Detective Johnson watched the chaos unfold, his face illuminated by the blue glow of the television. "We didn't just find a killer," he said quietly to his partner. "We found a mirror." The fingerprint had become more than evidence. It was a symbol, a reminder that the lines society drew between innocence and monstrosity were far thinner than anyone wanted to believe. In the courtroom, the fingerprint would take center stage. It was held up on a screen during preliminary hearings, glowing like a ghostly signature. The prosecution framed it as the silent witness, the unshakable proof of David Harvey's guilt. The defense tried to argue contamination, error, coercion, but every expert confirmed the match. There was no mistake. That tiny spiral of ridges carried the weight of an entire city's horror. Denise sat in the front row every day, her hands trembling, eyes fixed on her son. She couldn't reconcile the evidence with the boy she'd tucked into bed 1,000 times. "He's just a kid," she whispered again and again, as if saying it enough might undo the truth. Reporters scribbled furiously, cameras clicked, and every sigh, every tear, became part of the spectacle. David, for his part, remained unnervingly calm. He watched the proceedings with quiet fascination, occasionally turning his gaze toward the jury as though studying them. When the prosecution replayed his taped confession, the room fell silent. His voice, steady, emotionless, almost polite, filled the courtroom. "I just wanted to know what it felt like," he said. "To matter." A collective shiver rippled through the gallery. The fingerprint had spoken, but so had the voice behind it, and together, they told a story no one could forget. When the verdict was read, the city seemed to exhale all at once. Guilty. Life in prison. The sound of the gavel was both an ending and an echo, reverberating far beyond those courtroom walls. Outside, the press declared victory for justice. Inside, Detective Johnson sat in silence, staring at the print one last time. It wasn't victory he felt. It was grief. For Christopher, for the Harveys, for the fragile illusion that innocence could still be trusted. By the time the trial began, Miami was a city split down the middle. On one side were those who wanted justice, swift, absolute, unflinching. On the other were those who still clung to the belief that a 12-year-old boy couldn't possibly understand the full weight of what he'd done. Outside the courthouse, the air buzzed with heat and outrage. Reporters swarmed like locusts, microphones thrust toward anyone who had an opinion. Protesters lined the steps, some holding signs that read, "Justice for Christopher," others carrying posters saying, "He's just a child." The crowd shouted back and forth across the barricades, two sides of the same heartbreak, neither willing to yield. Inside, the marble halls echoed with footsteps and whispers, the anticipation almost unbearable. Every seat in the gallery was filled. Every camera was live. The Harvey case had stopped being a local tragedy. It had become a national obsession, a question about morality, childhood, and the nature of evil itself. Detective Mark Johnson walked through those doors each morning with a weight that never left his shoulders. He had seen killers before, monsters who'd long forfeited their humanity. But this was something else. The boy sitting at the defense table, hair neatly combed, hands folded in his lap, didn't look like a murderer. He looked like a student waiting for his name to be called for attendance. And that, Johnson realized, was what made the case so terrifying. The prosecution built its narrative meticulously. To them, David Harvey wasn't an innocent child. He was a calculating predator who had studied violence like a language and spoken it fluently. They projected images of the crime scene onto the courtroom screens. The neat arrangement of the body, the surgical precision of the wounds, the soda bottle that bore his fingerprint. Each photograph was a punch to the gut. "This," the prosecutor declared, "is not the work of a confused boy. This is the work of someone who understood exactly what he was doing." The defense countered with everything they had. They painted David as a product of neglect, a symptom of modern detachment, a child failed by parents, schools, and systems that never looked closely enough. They brought in psychologists who described the underdeveloped frontal lobe of an adolescent brain, explaining how impulse and empathy still wrestled for dominance at that age. "He's not a monster," one expert said softly. "He's a mirror, reflecting what we've allowed our children to become." The courtroom fell into uneasy silence. Every day, Denise Harvey sat behind her son, her hands trembling as she clutched a small photograph of him as a toddler. She still couldn't reconcile the image in her memory, the little boy with chocolate on his cheeks, with the calm, almost bored expression he wore in court. Sometimes she'd whisper his name, barely audible. He never turned around. Across the aisle, Maria Davis sat stone still, her grief too deep for tears. Her son was gone, and now she was being asked to watch the boy who took him argue for mercy. Between those two mothers hung an unbridgeable distance, one mourning a life stolen, the other mourning the boy she thought she knew. As the trial unfolded, America couldn't look away. Cable news ran live coverage, commentators dissecting every facial twitch, every legal motion, as if the courtroom were a stage. Headlines screamed, "The Child Killer" in bold fonts, while talk shows debated whether a child could even be evil. Some called for the death penalty. Others demanded rehabilitation. Hashtags trended hourly. The case became less about Christopher Davis or David Harvey and more about what each represented. To some, David was proof that society was rotting from within, that technology and isolation were breeding empathy-less children. To others, he was proof of a failing justice system too eager to destroy the young. It wasn't just a trial anymore. It was a referendum on morality. Outside the courthouse, tension turned volatile. One afternoon, a shouting match between protesters erupted into violence. Police formed a line, sirens wailed, and TV cameras captured the chaos live. The image went viral, a woman clutching a photo of Christopher screaming at another woman holding a sign that read, "Children need help, not chains." It was the perfect symbol of a nation at war with itself. Inside, David remained eerily detached. He never cried, never fidgeted, never looked nervous. If anything, he seemed fascinated by the spectacle he'd created. When reporters described him as cold, he smiled slightly the next day, as if proud of the title. The attention didn't scare him. It thrilled him. Every headline, every debate was proof that he mattered. And in that warped corner of his mind, that was all he'd ever wanted. Detective Johnson testified on the 7th day of the trial. He recounted the investigation, the crime scene, the fingerprint, and finally, the interrogation. His voice, steady but strained, filled the room with images no one could forget. "He spoke about it like he was describing a movie," Johnson said quietly. "There was no hesitation, no fear, just fascination." The jury watched him closely, some shaking their heads, others looking down at their notes. The defense objected, arguing emotion shouldn't influence judgment, but it was too late. The image had been drawn. By the end of his testimony, the courtroom felt colder. The prosecution rested its case with one final argument that would later be quoted on every network in America. "We are not here to decide if David Harvey is a child. We are here to decide if his actions were human." When the defense took the floor for closing statements, Denise wept openly. Her lawyer's voice broke as he pleaded for compassion, insisting that to sentence David to life would be to give up on the very idea of redemption. "If we decide a child cannot be saved," he said, "then what hope is left for any of us?" The courtroom sat in silence for nearly a minute after he finished. Outside, thunder rolled across the horizon as though the sky itself was undecided. When the jury finally returned after 14 hours of deliberation, the air inside the courtroom was suffocating. Reporters leaned forward. Cameras clicked. David looked almost serene. The foreman's voice trembled as he read the verdict. Guilty. The word echoed like a thunderclap. As the sentence was read, life in prison without parole, the city seemed to hold its breath. In that instant, Miami felt smaller, heavier, haunted. Denise collapsed into sobs. Maria Davis bowed her head, whispering a prayer no one could hear. Reporters rushed to capture reactions, but even the cameras seemed unsure where to point. The trial that had divided America was over, but there were no victors, only survivors. Outside the courthouse, the crowd erupted. Some cheered, others screamed. Signs were torn, tears shed, and the debate began anew. On television, analysts called it a landmark case. Activists called it a national tragedy. But for Detective Johnson, walking quietly through the courthouse lobby, it was neither. It was simply the end of a nightmare that no sentence could undo. He stopped near the doors, watching rain blur the city beyond the glass. In his mind, he saw two faces, Christopher's, gentle, trusting, and David's, expressionless, as if carved from something colder than flesh. The fingerprint, the trial, the verdict, all of it boiled down to one impossible truth. Innocence and evil can sometimes wear the same face. And as Johnson stepped out into the downpour, he couldn't shake the feeling that America, in trying to punish its monster, had also condemned a piece of its own soul. The walls of a juvenile detention center are not designed for evil. They're designed for correction, for the lost, the broken, the misguided. But when David Harvey arrived, escorted through the sterile corridors in an oversized jumpsuit and plastic cuffs, the guards quickly realized they were dealing with something different. He didn't cry. He didn't beg. He didn't ask for his mother. He simply looked around as though cataloging everything he saw, the cameras, the doors, the guards' movements. It was observation, not fear. To the staff, it was unsettling. To the psychologists assigned to evaluate him, it was a puzzle they were desperate to solve. How could a 12-year-old, barely tall enough to look over the table during intake, commit such a precise, unfeeling murder? In the beginning, they thought they might find trauma, abuse, neglect, neurological defects, anything to explain the void behind his eyes. But David's background was painfully ordinary. No violence at home, no addiction, no clear trigger. He was polite during sessions, articulate beyond his years, and disturbingly self-aware. When Dr. Rachel Lynn, the lead forensic psychologist, asked if he understood why he was there, he nodded calmly. "Because I made everyone afraid," he said. "Not because I killed someone. Not because I did something wrong. Just that. Fear. As if it were a project he'd completed successfully." For Dr. Lynn, that single sentence marked the beginning of months of sleepless nights. In every session, David spoke as if he were narrating a documentary about someone else. He used phrases like the subject and the experiment. When asked to describe Christopher Davis, he didn't talk about a person. He talked about variables. "He was strong," David explained once, "but he panicked too quickly. That's why it ended faster than I expected." Dr. Lynn pressed him. What did he mean by expected? David shrugged. "I thought people would last longer." That clinical detachment terrified even seasoned professionals. He never showed anger or remorse. His tone was always neutral, his posture perfect, his words measured. When asked about emotions, he treated them as data points. "When people cry," he once told a therapist, "it means you've reached the right place in them." Another time, when shown photos of faces expressing fear, pain, and joy, he identified each one instantly, but never seemed to register the feelings themselves. It wasn't that he didn't understand emotions intellectually. It was that he didn't feel them. The clinical term for it was callous, unemotional traits, often linked to psychopathy. But in David's case, it went further. He wasn't born broken, as some experts first assumed. He was born blank, and he'd spent his short life studying what made others human, the way a scientist studies an unfamiliar species. "He mimics empathy," Dr. Lynn wrote in her notes, "but does not experience it. His understanding of pain is academic, not emotional." She'd dealt with sociopaths before, but none who were still children. What unsettled the staff most wasn't his violence, it was his calm. In prison, rage is currency. Fear is survival, but David neither fought nor fled. He observed. When older inmates tried to intimidate him, he didn't react. One guard recalled how an older boy had cornered him during recreation, shoving him against a wall and threatening him. David just stared at him silently until the other boy backed away. It was like looking into a mirror that didn't blink, the guard later said. Over time, the other inmates stopped messing with him, not because they pitied him, but because something about his silence made them uneasy. He'd sit alone in the cafeteria, hands folded neatly, eyes drifting from one table to another, like a scientist watching test subjects interact. Once, another inmate asked what he was staring at. David smiled faintly and said, "I'm learning." When word spread that he'd said it, even the guards started giving him space. His reputation grew, half myth, half warning. The boy who smiled at nothing. The kid who could freeze a room just by looking at you. For Dr. Lin and the other psychologists, every evaluation became a tug-of-war between fascination and dread. They ran cognitive empathy tests, brain scans, emotional recognition trials. The results were consistent: high intelligence, low effective empathy, complete absence of remorse. When asked if he missed freedom, he said, "Freedom's overrated. Control is better." When Dr. Lin asked if he thought about Christopher, he tilted his head and replied, "Sometimes. But mostly I think about how careful I'll have to be next time." She ended the session early that day. By the time David turned 14, his case had become a cornerstone of criminal psychology. Teams of experts visited to study him, professors wrote papers, documentaries replayed his interviews with unnerving fascination. To the public, he was a monster. To science, he was a phenomenon. Some saw him as proof of born psychopathy, others as evidence that nurture and neglect could sculpt even an ordinary child into something unrecognizable. But for the psychologists who sat across from him day after day, he was simply a mirror reflecting the limits of their understanding. "When you look at him," Dr. Lin said during a later interview, "you realize how fragile morality really is. We like to think empathy is instinctive, but what if it's not? What if it's a choice, and some people just never choose it?" Her colleagues nodded, but no one answered. Meanwhile, David adjusted to prison life with disturbing ease. He followed rules, read constantly, never caused trouble. He became a model inmate, earning privileges faster than anyone expected. To most staff, he was polite, respectful, even likable. But Dr. Lin saw the performance for what it was: a mask. "He's adapting," she warned the warden in one report. "He's learning what you reward. That's not rehabilitation. That's rehearsal." Few listened. After all, he was just a boy. Behind closed doors, David's evolution continued. He requested psychology books, biographies of historical killers, forensic manuals. He read everything, absorbing information like oxygen. In one session, Dr. Lin asked why he was so drawn to such material. His answer was simple: "Because they all made mistakes. I want to know where they went wrong." The calmness with which he said it chilled her more than any outburst could have. Over time, she began to realize that David wasn't trying to understand morality or guilt. He was studying consequence. Prison hadn't reformed him, it had refined him. Each rule he followed, each expression he mimicked, was part of a larger experiment in survival. He once told another inmate, "They think I'm fixed. That's how I'll know I'm good at it." It wasn't a confession. It was pride. He had learned what fear looked like, what pity sounded like, how to say the right words with the right tone. To the untrained eye, he appeared changed, rehabilitated. But those who knew what to look for saw the truth. Behind that polite smile still lived a child who viewed humanity not as a connection, but as a system to be studied, manipulated, and controlled. And as the years passed, that system became his only obsession. The world had named him a monster. He had simply learned to agree. and to wear the title like a crown. By the time David Harvey turned 15, he was no longer just a prisoner. He was a phenomenon, a name whispered in criminology classrooms, debated on news panels, and dissected in podcasts that claimed to explore the mind of evil. What unsettled people most wasn't his crime anymore. It was what came after. Inside the walls of the juvenile correctional facility, David had become something of an enigma. Teachers described him as brilliant, guards as unsettlingly polite, and psychologists as a perfect storm of intelligence and emptiness. He read constantly: psychology, philosophy, anatomy, history, anything that helped him understand power. One guard once said that watching David read was like watching someone absorb the world for ammunition. He wasn't devouring knowledge to learn, he was stockpiling it. He aced every educational program the system offered, completed his GED at 13, and began mentoring other inmates soon after. To the outside world, these were signs of rehabilitation, a redemption arc the public could cling to. But those who interacted with him daily saw the same quiet manipulation that had defined him from the start. He didn't mentor because he cared. He mentored because it gave him control. Inmates twice his age began seeking his advice. Some feared him. Others admired him. But everyone, whether consciously or not, revolved around him. He was still a child in body, but in that cold ecosystem of punishment and survival, David Harvey had become something else entirely, a leader, born from calculation rather than compassion. Outside the prison walls, the legend of the child killer who smiled was metastasizing. Documentaries aired on late-night television, each promising exclusive insight into his psyche. One journalist described him as the modern-day embodiment of the banality of evil. Another called him a mind too dangerous for freedom, too intelligent for confinement. The public couldn't look away. He had become a paradox, both a warning and an obsession. Parents whispered his name when their children misbehaved. True crime enthusiasts traded theories about his motives in online forums, and university lectures used his interviews as case studies in emerging psychopathy. Even the tabloids found a way to sensationalize him, printing old photos of him in Halloween costumes under headlines like "The Monster Next Door." The world, it seemed, had turned his horror into entertainment. David knew it too. The prison allowed limited media access, and though he was forbidden from interviews, he still managed to get hold of articles, clippings, even transcripts. He'd study them, annotating margins with small, deliberate notes. During one session, Dr. Lin found a folded newspaper tucked in his notebook. On it, he'd circled a headline, "The Youngest Killer in America Speaks," and written beside it, "They're still listening." That sentence haunted her, because he was right. The same world that had condemned him was now hanging on his every word. In his own detached way, David had achieved exactly what he'd wanted all along. He mattered. As months turned into years, his reputation began to evolve. The public fascination with his intellect overshadowed the horror of his crime. Television producers described him as a misunderstood genius, and online supporters, calling themselves the Harvey Truthers, argued that his intelligence proved he was more victim than villain. They claimed the system had failed him, that society had created him. They exchanged letters with him, sent him books, even artwork depicting him as a misunderstood prodigy. The prison mailroom overflowed with envelopes, some hateful, most disturbingly adoring. "You're the smartest person I've ever read about," one letter began. "I think you just needed someone to understand you." Another read, "I don't believe you meant to hurt anyone. You were just curious, like me." These letters became his trophies. He kept them neatly organized, rereading them with quiet satisfaction. In his mind, each one proved his theory that people were predictable, manipulable, easy to bend. When Dr. Lin confronted him about it, he smiled faintly. "They want to believe in redemption," he said. "It makes them feel safe. She asked if he believed in redemption himself. He paused, tilted his head, and said, "Why would I need it?" By 16, he had perfected the art of speaking in riddles, answers that sounded profound but revealed nothing. He once told a documentary crew, "People call me evil because it's easier than admitting they don't understand me." The interview never aired. The prison revoked all filming privileges afterward. But the damage was already done. The myth of David Harvey had outgrown the walls built to contain him. Inside, his influence continued to spread quietly. Guards trusted him. Teachers praised him. Even some psychologists began to wonder if he might truly have changed. He wrote essays about morality and control that won statewide academic competitions. He spoke at juvenile rehabilitation panels through recorded messages. His words were measured, eloquent, hauntingly persuasive. "Evil," he once said in a speech broadcast to a youth outreach program, "isn't born. It's built by neglect. I wasn't born bad. I was just never shown another way." The audience applauded. No one saw the small smirk that followed once the camera light went off. Dr. Lynn did. She was one of the few who still saw through the performance. In her notes, she described him as a master manipulator of emotion, fluent in empathy but devoid of it. She warned officials that his apparent rehabilitation was a facade, but the system, always eager for success stories, preferred hope over horror. "He's grown," one warden said in an interview. "He's proof that even the darkest cases can find light." And so, the myth deepened. By 17, David had become a symbol of redemption for some and a symbol of danger for others, a mirror reflecting whatever the world wanted to see. The irony, of course, was that the world had once called him a monster. Now, they were making him a celebrity. When Dr. Lynn retired, she gave one final interview about David Harvey. "He's not insane," she said quietly. "He's not broken. He's aware. Terrifyingly aware. Every word, every smile, every silence is calculated. If he ever walks free, he won't make the same mistake twice." It was a warning, though few took it seriously. After all, he was still just a teenager. How much harm could he do from behind bars? But deep inside his cell, surrounded by stacks of letters and books, David continued to study, to write, to wait. He had patience now. The kind born from knowing the world hadn't forgotten him. In the quiet hours after lights out, he'd stare through the small window above his bed, tracing the faint outline of the moon. To him, it wasn't a symbol of confinement, but of rhythm. Everything, fear, fame, fascination, moved in cycles. "People always come back to what they fear," he'd once told Dr. Lynn. "They just call it curiosity." Whether he understood the full truth of his own words, no one could say. But one thing was clear. David Harvey had become exactly what he always wanted to be. Not a boy, not a victim, not even a killer. He had become a story. And in a world obsessed with stories, that might be the most dangerous kind of monster of all. Long after the cameras stopped rolling and the courthouse emptied, the story of David Harvey refused to fade. It lingered in the air like humidity after a storm, thick, heavy, impossible to ignore. Years passed, but the questions his case raised continued to echo in classrooms, courtrooms, and late-night conversations. How does a child become capable of deliberate evil? Was David born broken, or did society shape him that way? Psychologists debated endlessly, dissecting his brain scans, his interviews, his environment, searching for a neat explanation that never came. What terrified them most wasn't what they found, but what they didn't. There was no single cause, no tragic trigger, no grand revelation. David wasn't the product of an abusive home or a violent upbringing. He was, by all accounts, ordinary. And that was what made him so chilling. Evil, people realized, didn't always wear a mask or carry a weapon. Sometimes it sat quietly at the dinner table, said please and thank you, and smiled on command. The case shattered long-held assumptions about morality and youth, forcing society to confront the idea that innocence is not a guarantee of goodness. He made us question what it means to be human, one criminologist said years later. And worse, he made us realize how fragile that definition really is. In the years that followed, the justice system changed in subtle but lasting ways. Lawmakers rewrote statutes about juvenile sentencing, trying to strike an impossible balance between accountability and mercy. Some argued that children, no matter how horrific their crimes, could not truly comprehend the permanence of death. Others countered that David Harvey had proven comprehension was no longer the issue. Intent was. If a child can plan, execute, and conceal, one prosecutor said during a legislative hearing, then that child can choose. The debate became less about one boy and more about a species capable of producing him. Psychologists coined new terms: emerging psychopathy, affective detachment disorder, labels that tried to contain something that might never be fully understood. Universities added case studies of David Harvey to their curricula. Criminology students watched his interrogation tapes like scripture. "He's not just a case," a professor told his class. "He's a warning." And yet, in a culture addicted to fascination, that warning blurred into fascination itself. True crime podcasts turned his story into serialized entertainment. Streaming documentaries reenacted his life with brooding narration and dramatic lighting. Each one claimed to seek truth. Each one, in its own way, kept the myth alive. The boy who killed to feel important had achieved an immortality he could never have earned in life. Every download, every article, every whispered retelling was proof that, in the end, he had won the only game he ever wanted to play: the game of being remembered. The legacy of David Harvey is not one of violence, it's one of reflection. His name became a mirror held up to an uncomfortable truth about modern society: that empathy, once considered instinctive, might now be optional. The rise of technology, social isolation, and desensitization had created a generation fluent in information, but starved for connection. In many ways, David was its logical conclusion: a child who mistook understanding for feeling, who could articulate compassion but never experience it. He was not an outlier, some argued, but a symptom, the product of screens that replaced faces, games that replaced consequences, and systems that rewarded performance over sincerity. He learned to mimic humanity because we taught him how, Dr. Rachel Lynn wrote in her final paper before retirement. We applauded intelligence without empathy, confidence without conscience. David Harvey simply became what the world rewarded. Her words became both a professional indictment and a societal confession. The story forced people to confront uncomfortable questions. If a child can learn empathy by imitation, can it also be lost the same way? And if so, how many others like David are quietly learning in the shadows, unnoticed because they smile at the right moments? Even now, more than a decade later, David Harvey's name lingers in the public consciousness, not as a headline, but as a symbol. He remains the case that haunts every psychologist, every teacher, every parent who wonders what darkness can hide behind normalcy. His prison records show no disciplinary infractions. He reads, writes, studies. He is, by all outward measures, rehabilitated. And yet those who've met him say his calm is still unnerving, his politeness still rehearsed. One former warden described it best: "You look into his eyes, and you realize he's studying you. Not out of fear or interest, just calculation." He still receives letters, hundreds of them. Admirers, sympathizers, the curious. Sometimes, he replies. Always brief, always polite. "I'm doing well," one letter read. "People are still learning from me." That was all. And perhaps that's the truest legacy of all, that a boy who once saw death as an experiment now lives as one. The world still studies him, still argues about him, still builds theories in his shadow. But beneath all the analysis, one haunting truth endures. David Harvey didn't just kill a man. He killed the illusion that evil always looks like a monster. And maybe that's why, even now, the story refuses to end. Because deep down, we're not just afraid of what he did. We're afraid of how much of him might exist in all of us. Evil doesn't always come with warning signs. Sometimes it hides behind politeness, behind perfect grades, behind a smile that seems just a little too steady. David Harvey was never supposed to exist in the way he did. A 12-year-old boy capable of calculation without conscience, intelligence without empathy. But he did. And in doing so, he forced us to look at the fragile architecture of what we call humanity. We like to believe monsters are born in darkness, in broken homes, in tragedy, in pain. But what if they're born in ordinary houses, on quiet streets, surrounded by love that never quite reaches the heart it's meant to touch? What if evil isn't the opposite of innocence, but its echo? Christopher Davis's death shattered one family, one city, one sense of safety. But his story, and David's, revealed something deeper about us all. That understanding without compassion is just intelligence wearing a mask. That the scariest monsters are the ones who don't see themselves as monsters at all. And so the world keeps studying him, the boy who smiled in court, who became a mirror for everything we fear we might be capable of. His story ends behind walls, but its questions, they're still out here, with us.